Hi everyone, now you are watching my channel. All the content I create myself, new videos every day, so don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means a lot. Thanks, bye!
I smelled the smoke before I heard Ezra call my name. By the time I got to the backyard, his school bag was already burning. So were the books inside it. So was the sketch he'd made of his mother's face from an old photograph, the one he'd kept on his wall for 8 years without anyone telling him to put it away. My wife stood next to the fire with her arms crossed. She gave us an hour to leave. What she forgot, standing there in the yard she believed was hers, was that her name wasn't the only one on the deed. If stories like this find you at the right moment, subscribe. There are more coming, and I don't want you to miss the next one. The smoke was the first thing. Not the sound of Ezra's voice, not the creak of the back door, just the smell reaching me through the kitchen window while I was washing a coffee mug. The kind of smell that the body recognizes before the mind has caught up. I set the mug down and walked outside, and what I saw in the backyard I have replayed many times since. Not because I want to, but because certain things embed themselves without asking permission. Natasha was standing beside a metal trash bin with flames coming out of the top. She was facing away from me, arms crossed, watching the fire the way someone watches a problem being solved. Ezra stood about 3 feet to her left, close enough to feel the heat. He was not crying. He had clearly already done that. I understood what was burning before I got close enough to see clearly. The shape of the bag. The color of one strap that hadn't caught yet that specific shade of blue that I had watched Ezra pick out in the store in August. His school bag. And what was inside it, the books, the sketch pad he'd been carrying everywhere for the last 6 months. The drawing he had made of his mother's face from a photograph he kept on his wall. The one he'd asked me to take down from the wall and put in his bag last week so he could look at it during lunch. Natasha said she had made her decision. She said it without turning around. She said the house was hers. She said she wanted us out within the hour. I looked at Ezra. He looked at me, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a child who needed someone to fix something. It was the expression of a child who had already understood that this was not fixable and was simply waiting to see what came next. He was 11 years old. He had learned to read rooms before most people his age had learned to read books. I told him to go inside and get what he needed. He asked about his drawings. I told him to take whatever was still there. I went inside without arguing, which was more composure than I had at that moment. Let me tell you about who Natasha had been before she became the person standing next to that fire. I don't mean this as softness or as a way of excusing what she did. I mean it because the story is not honest if I leave out the version of her that I married, the version that made the subsequent years make sense. When I met Natasha, she was quick and warm, and she noticed things about people that most people missed. She noticed on our third date that I ordered for Ezra before I ordered for myself, and she mentioned it not as an observation but as something she found worth saying. I had been a single father for 4 years by then, and no one outside my immediate family had ever seemed to register that specific ordering of priorities as meaningful. There was a night not long after we started spending real time together when Ezra came down with a fever. I had called to cancel plans, and Natasha had offered to come over anyway, not to be with me but to help. She sat with him on the couch with a damp cloth and a television remote while I went to find the thermometer, and when I came back he had fallen asleep against her shoulder. She didn't move for nearly an hour. She looked up at me when I came back in and said nothing, just a look that communicated something about choosing to be present rather than performing the act of being present. That distinction had always mattered to me. I had spent 4 years learning to tell the difference. A few months in Ezra stopped calling her Miss Natasha and started calling her Tasha. He did it once without thinking and then looked up to see if she minded. She smiled at the floor and said nothing about it, which was exactly the right response because anything she'd said would have turned it into a moment, and it didn't need to be a moment. It just needed to be true. That was the person I married. The change that came later did not erase who she had been. It just settled on top of it, and eventually I couldn't find the original anymore. The shift happened over the course of about 2 years, and I could tell you the approximate month it began, but not a single specific day because it was the kind of change that operates through accumulation. More evenings out. Plans with Ezra that got moved to next weekend and then to the weekend after that. A particular way she started holding her phone face down when we were all in the same room, which was new, which meant something, and which I did not name because naming it meant deciding. Theo entered the picture 8 months before the fire. I knew the name before I knew who it belonged to. She mentioned it once attached to a sentence about someone helping her with something professionally, and I filed it in the part of my mind where I was keeping other things I wasn't ready to examine. I would eventually learn someone she had met at an event, someone who offered her a particular kind of attention that she had decided she was no longer getting at home. I don't know exactly what she told him about us. I know what she told me, that he was a friend, that she needed space to figure out what she wanted, that our marriage had become something she couldn't keep being inside. The morning of the fire was a Saturday. Ezra had been at the kitchen table working on a new sketch, something architectural he'd been planning for weeks. Natasha had been in the bedroom with the door closed, which had become standard. Around 2 in the afternoon, she went into the backyard, and that was when I smelled the smoke. After Ezra went inside, I walked to the fire and looked at what was in it. Most of the bag was gone. The sketch pad was gone. The photograph was gone. When Ezra came back out, he was carrying a small duffel with whatever he'd grabbed. He walked to where the fire was dying down and looked into the bin. There was one part of the bag that hadn't fully caught the bottom panel, thick canvas partially protected by the books that had burned faster. He reached in without flinching and pulled it out. He held it for a moment. It was the shape of the bottom of a bag, charred along the edges, still warm. I said nothing. He said nothing. He put it in the duffel. We got in the car. I drove to a strip mall parking lot, fluorescent lights not attached to anything significant. The kind of place where you can sit in a car and not be anywhere. Ezra sat in the passenger seat holding the duffel on his lap. I called my lawyer from the car while Ezra looked out the window. My lawyer's name was Reeves, and I told her the situation in under 4 minutes. She asked if I had documentation of joint ownership of the property. I told her I had the deed on my phone. She asked about other shared assets. I went through them: the joint bank account, the investment account, 2 vehicles registered in both names. She told me there was a process called a marital asset preservation order, a freeze that could be applied for in cases where a spouse had demonstrated willingness to destroy shared property. She said the fire, if documented, would be relevant. I told her I had neighbors with cameras, and I had Ezra, who had been standing 3 feet away. She said to call her in the morning. I said I would. I looked at Ezra. He was looking at a sign for a pizza place. He asked if we could get pizza. I said yes. He said he wanted the one with the garlic bread crust. I said I remembered. We ate in the car with the windows down. The sun was finishing going down over the strip mall. When he was done, Ezra put the rest in the box and looked out the window and said, "Is Tasha going to be in the house tonight?" I said yes. "Is it still our house?" I told him it was still our house technically, and that it would take some time to work through, but that we were not going to lose what was ours. He thought about this. Then he said, "The drawing of Mom is gone." I said I knew. He said I can make another one. I didn't answer that because I didn't have to. He knew what he was saying, and I knew what he was saying, and we both understood that the offer was more for me than for him. We checked into a hotel near his school so he wouldn't have to change his bus route. 2 beds, a small table, a window that faced a parking structure. The kind of place that becomes a temporary fact of your life and then becomes later a thing you remember as one of the nights you made it through. Ezra put the charred panel from his bag on the table by the window before he got into bed. I sat at that table after the lights were out and the glow from the parking structure through the curtain, and I looked at it. That was the night I stopped trying to save the marriage. The first 3 days in the hotel had a rhythm that neither of us chose, but that we fell into anyway, the way people find rhythms in temporary places because the alternative is acknowledging that the place is temporary. Ezra went to school. I drove him each morning and picked him up each afternoon because the bus stop was 2 blocks from the house, and I didn't want him walking past it until we had more clarity about what the house was going to mean for us going forward. He didn't ask to go past it. I worked from the hotel table during the days. My job at the insurance company had the advantage of being portable in a way that the current situation required, and I was grateful for the structure of it. the specific language of actuarial tables and compliance documentation, which asked nothing of me emotionally and required only the particular kind of attention I was capable of giving at that point. I answered emails. I reviewed documents. I made calls in the parking structure where the signal was better and Ezra wouldn't overhear anything. Reeves and I spoke every morning. The process she had initiated moved through 2 stages in the first week. The first was the emergency motion, a request to the court to freeze the marital assets as a protective measure during divorce proceedings on the grounds that demonstrated destruction of shared property, indicated willingness to dissipate marital assets unilaterally. The legal language is dense, but the argument is simple. If someone has already burned a school bag, the court has reason to believe they might also try to move money or transfer property before a fair division can occur. The fire was documented. A neighbor had camera footage from the driveway that showed the smoke column. Ezra had been present. The second stage was the divorce filing itself, initiated by me with a request for primary residential custody of Ezra, on the grounds that his primary caregiver for the past 11 years had been his father, and that his current living situation in the marital home had been disrupted by his stepmother's actions. Reeves was careful with me about expectations. She told me asset freezes get contested, that Natasha would retain her own counsel, and that counsel would argue the freeze was punitive rather than protective. She told me to let her do the legal talking and to document everything which I was already doing. I kept a log on my phone, times, dates, specific things said or done, a record of the kind that a person who understands how these things work starts keeping before they fully admit to themselves that they are going to need it. On the 4th day after the fire, Ezra sat at the hotel table in the evening and started drawing. He used the hotel notepad, the small one with the brand name at the top, and a pencil he'd had in his jacket pocket. He drew for about 40 minutes without looking up. I was at the other side of the table reading something on my laptop that I wasn't really reading, and I watched him without making it obvious that I was watching. When he finished, he turned the notepad around so I could see it. It was the charred panel. He'd drawn it from the angle it was sitting at on the table by the window, that specific position with the scorch marks rendered carefully and the texture of the canvas done in cross-hatching. It was the most technically precise thing I had seen him draw. I told him it was good. He said he knew, which was not arrogance. It was the accurate self-assessment of someone who had been drawing since he was 4 years old and knew what his own work looked like. He tore the page off the notepad and folded it and put it in the pocket of his jacket. That night, after he was asleep, I sat at the table and looked at the panel itself, the real one, the burned canvas by the window, and I thought about what it meant that he'd needed to document it. Not the fire, the object. The specific thing that had survived the fire in its damaged form and was still here, still had a shape. The 4th day was also when Natasha made her first attempt to use the joint account. Reeves had told me the freeze would take several business days to fully process. The alert came to my phone at 11:17 in the morning, attempted withdrawal from the joint account declined system flag for frozen status. The amount she had tried to withdraw was not small. I noted it in the log and sent it to Reeves. Natasha called me that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail and listened to the message. She was not screaming. She was calm in the way people are calm when they are managing a specific kind of panic. She said the freeze was unnecessary and retaliatory. She said she needed access to the account to pay for things she needed. She said I was using the legal system to punish her. She did not mention Ezra. I called Reeves and left a message about the voicemail. I did not call Natasha back. The second call came the following evening while Ezra and I were eating dinner from takeout containers at the hotel table. I saw her name on the screen. Ezra saw it too. He looked at the phone and then looked at his food and continued eating, which was its own kind of answer about what he needed from me in that moment. I let it go to voicemail again. This one was different. Her voice had changed. Not crying, but something adjacent to it. Something that, in a different context, might have reached me. She said she hadn't meant for things to go this far. She said she had been under a lot of pressure and had made a decision she hadn't fully thought through. She said she wanted to talk. I listened to it twice. Then I closed my phone. On the 5th day after the fire, Natasha tried to use the credit card attached to the joint account. She was at a restaurant with Theo. Reeves had told me the card would also be flagged under the freeze. I know this because the restaurant called the number on file, which was mine, to advise that a card had been declined and to confirm whether there was a second form of payment. I said there was no second form of payment and thanked them for calling. I heard about the rest through Reeves, who heard it from other channels. Theo had been at the dinner. The card had been declined in front of him. Natasha had paid with a personal card she had separately, but the specific moment of the decline, the expression on his face was a different kind of information than she had been working with up to that point. On the seventh day, Reeves confirmed the full freeze was in place. All joint assets, the bank account, the investment account, the 2 vehicles, the house itself were under court management until the divorce proceedings concluded. Natasha could not sell, withdraw, transfer, or encumber any of it without court approval. That evening, Ezra asked if he could write a letter. He said it without much preamble. We were watching something on the hotel television and he reached over and turned the volume down, which was his signal for wanting to say something he had been thinking about for a while. He said he wanted to write a letter to Theo. He said he had something he wanted to tell him. I asked if he wanted to tell me what it was first. He said he'd rather just write it and have me send it. I told him I could do that. He wrote the letter that night at the hotel table with the same careful focus he brought to his drawings. Not quickly. Not with any visible agitation, just the particular concentration of someone who knows what they want to say and is finding the words for it one at a time. When he was done, he folded it, wrote Theo on the outside, and left it on the table. I didn't read it. He had written it, and it was his. In the morning before school, he asked if I would send it. I said I would. He got in the car and we drove to school and talked about whether the cafeteria had fixed the vending machine and whether his science project being due Thursday mattered now that it was already finished. I sent the letter after I dropped him off. I drove back to the hotel and sat at the table and looked at the burned panel of the bag still sitting by the window and thought about what kind of person writes a letter to the man who had been with his stepmother while she was burning his school bag. The kind of person who finds the one part of a complicated thing he can address directly, the one person he can reach and says whatever he needs to say. That was Ezra. That had always been Ezra. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the fire. In that time, the hotel had become a fact of our life, rather than a temporary condition. Ezra's new school bag hanging on the hook by the door, the charred panel from the old one still on the table by the window, 2 toothbrush holders on the bathroom counter because the space needed a system. We had stopped counting the days. Reeves had prepared me for a contested proceeding. Natasha's attorney had filed 2 motions in the preceding week, both aimed at characterizing the asset freeze as disproportionate and retaliatory. The arguments were not illogical. They simply required the court to weigh them against the evidence of what had prompted the freeze in the first place, which was a fire in a backyard and a child standing 3 feet from it. Reeves was not worried. She said that when the facts are clear, the job of a good attorney is to stay out of their way. I sat in the courtroom that Tuesday in a suit I had dry cleaned in a laundromat near the hotel, and I thought about what I wanted from myself in the room. Not from the proceeding. I understood what I wanted from the proceeding. I mean what I wanted from my own behavior. I had spent 11 years raising a child, and I did not want to be the person who walked into a courtroom looking for blood. I wanted to be the person who walked in with documentation and walked out with clarity. Natasha arrived with her attorney. She was wearing something professional, and her expression was the expression of someone managing a performance. She did not look at me. I looked at her for a moment, and then I looked at Reeves, who was sorting papers with the methodical calm of someone who had done this many times before. The motion to contest the asset freeze was heard first. Natasha's attorney argued that the freeze had been imposed on the basis of a single incident that had been mischaracterized, that the destruction of property was an emotional reaction to a difficult personal situation, not willful dissipation of marital assets, and that the freeze was preventing Natasha from meeting ordinary living expenses. Reeves responded by presenting the neighbor's camera footage, Ezra's written statement prepared with the assistance of his school counselor, and the record of the account access attempt made within days of the fire. She noted that the items burned had included personal possessions belonging to a minor child purchased during the marriage, and that the act had been followed promptly by an attempt to withdraw a significant sum from the joint account. The judge asked Natasha's attorney one question about the timeline of the account access attempt relative to the fire. The attorney's answer required two clarifications which told me what I needed to know about how the argument was holding up. The motion to lift the freeze was denied. The divorce proceeding moved to the asset division question. Reeves had prepared a clear accounting what had been brought into the marriage, what had been acquired during it, the contributions of each party to the house and the other joint assets. I had been the primary wage earner for the first several years while Natasha was building her income. The house down payment had been predominantly mine. The investment account had been funded mostly by my contributions. These facts were documented because financial facts tend to be documented without anyone specifically trying to preserve them. On the question of Ezra, Natasha's attorney made a general statement about her desire to maintain a relationship with her stepson, but did not file a formal custody contest. Reeves told me afterward that this was likely strategic, given the camera footage and the written account of what had happened in the backyard. A custody fight would have required Natasha to argue that the environment she had created was nonetheless appropriate for a child. Her attorney had apparently calculated that this was not an argument worth making. The terms established that Ezra would live with me and that any contact with Natasha would be at Ezra's discretion. When the session ended, I stood outside the courthouse in the early afternoon light and called Reeves from the sidewalk to confirm I had understood the ruling correctly. She confirmed it. She told me the paperwork would take a few more weeks, but that the core decisions were established. I thanked her and ended the call. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not thinking about anything specific, just standing. A week later, Natasha asked to meet in person before everything was finalized. I said yes on the condition that we meet somewhere public and brief. She chose a coffee place near the neighborhood. She was already there when I arrived. She looked different from the courtroom, less managed, more like the person I had known in the middle years of the marriage. She had coffee. She didn't offer me anything. She asked why I had done it the way I did. She said she understood the divorce, but not the freeze, not the speed of it, not the completeness. She said it felt like a trap. I told her the freeze was not a trap. It was the legal consequence of what she had done in the backyard applied through a process that existed precisely for situations where one party demonstrated willingness to act unilaterally with shared property. I told her I had not designed the process. I had used it. She said she hadn't meant for things to go that far. I said I believed her. I also said that what she meant and what she did were two separate things, and that the consequences of what she did were not governed by what she meant. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had been unhappy for a long time and she hadn't known how to say it. I told her I was sorry she had been unhappy. I meant that. I told her the way to have said it was to say it, not to make a fire in the backyard, while an 11-year-old was standing next to it and then give us an hour to leave. She didn't have an answer for that. I didn't need her to. I told her one last thing, that the marriage had been real, that the years had been real, and that I did not regret most of them. But that she had crossed a line that was not about the marriage. The marriage I could end. What she had done in front of Ezra to things that were his while he watched, that was not a marital matter. That was a decision about what a child's feelings were worth in a moment when she was focused entirely on her own. She looked at the table. I told her I hoped she figured out what she was looking for. I meant that too. I left before she did. About a month after the hearing, I received a call from Theo. I did not call to argue or explain. His voice had the quality of someone who has read something and is still inside it. He said he had received Ezra's letter. He said he had not known the details of what had happened the day of the fire. He had known about the separation, but not the specifics of what Ezra had witnessed and what had been burned. He said he wanted me to know that. I thanked him for calling. He said one more thing, whatever. Ezra had written, and he didn't read it to me, which was the right instinct. It was the kind of thing that was hard to receive, and he thought I should know the kid had written it. I said I knew. I said the kid had always been that way. Ezra never told me the full contents of the letter. About a week after Theo called, we were in the car driving home from school, and Ezra asked if Theo had gotten it. I said yes, that Theo had called to say so. Ezra nodded and looked out the window and said, "Good." I didn't ask him to explain. Some things close themselves properly and don't need a hand. 6 months after the fire, we moved back into the house. The court had awarded me the property as primary residence given Ezra's custody arrangement and my documented financial contribution to its purchase. Natasha received a settlement from the other assets that Reeves considered fair given the circumstances, and that I did not contest because it was fair. Natasha had moved to an apartment across town. The first thing Ezra did when we got back was go to his room and stand in the middle of it. He didn't say anything. He looked at the walls where his things had been, and then he went to his bag and started taking things out and putting them back in their places. He had brought the charred panel from the hotel. He hung it on a hook on the back of his closet door, which was not where I would have put it, but it was where he wanted it. He chose green for the walls, a shade close to the color of the hoodie that had been in the bag that burned. I did not ask about the choice. What burns in a fire is not always what you lose. The things that matter have a way of surviving in other forms, in a drawing on a hotel notepad, in a letter mailed to someone who needed to receive it in a shade of paint, chosen by a kid who knew exactly why he was choosing it. I spent 16 years protecting a marriage. The thing I should have been protecting was always in the next room. Don't mistake the building for what it holds, and don't let the people who decide what you're worth make that decision when they think you have no way to answer back. If this one found you at the right moment, subscribe and come back for the next story. The ones ahead are worth your time.